My wife, Cindy, is Korean American. And when we started dating, her parents were not thrilled because I'm not Korean. Some of you might have not been aware of that, but I'm not. Now, if she were to mention me when we started dating, if she would bring me up in conversation, her parents would just ignore anything she had said. It's like, if we just don't acknowledge this guy, maybe he won't exist. They were not thrilled that she was dating me. Why? I think there was some distrust of non-Koreans, distrust of white guys like me. I think there was some fear of the unknown, and fear of change. I have a diagram. This is the situation we were in. Okay, there was me, there was Cindy's parents, and there was a wall between us. I took a class in seminary on advanced graphics for PowerPoint, so that's why it's kind of complex, but that's supposed to show me and Cindy's parents with a wall between us, okay? So I looked at this situation, I said, I'm not just going to sit here doing nothing. I'm going to somehow build a bridge between me and Cindy's parents. I'm going to do whatever it takes to communicate with them. I'm going to do whatever it takes to connect with them. So I thought, well, what can I do? The quickest, easiest thing would have been to just send an email to them. But that's not what I did. I wrote a handwritten letter in Korean. Now, kind of. I'll explain. So it took me weeks. I spent weeks working on this letter and telling them what a great person Cindy is, what a safe guy I am. And I know something of Korean culture, so I really sought to honor them in this letter. And then I said, well, who can put this in Korean? Because at the time, my Korean was kind of rusty. It's still non-existent. But I was doing campus ministry at the time, and I found a student from Korea who I knew and asked her if she would translate the letter for me. So she carried this letter around for days, and she interpreted word by word in the most formal, honorific language she could. And then I sent the letter to Cindy's parents. When I sent the letter, it was like this, right? Just this bridge over the wall. Now, was the letter successful? Well, we've been married for 20 years now, so I'm going to say yes. I'm going to give that a yes. Why did I do this? Why did I take the time and energy and effort to communicate with Cindy's parents in her own language? Love, right? I did it for love. Love goes the extra mile. Love goes the extra mile. And that's what we see in the gospel of Jesus Christ. See, this is what the world is like as Scripture describes it. There is God, and there are the people that God made, but there's a wall between us and God. And that wall exists because people have a certain distrust of God, and this certain fear of the unknown, and even fear of change. And God said, well, I'm going to do something to build a bridge over this wall. I'm going to do whatever it takes to communicate with these people, with my people I made. I'm going to do whatever it takes to connect with them. So God sent Jesus. Jesus is the bridge between God and us. Why did God do this? Because that's what love does. Love goes the extra mile. Love goes the extra mile to build a bridge, to communicate, to connect. Love goes the extra mile to reach out to another and meet them where they're at. That's what God did in Jesus Christ. John 1:14 puts it this way: the Word, which is God, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The Word, which is God, became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. This verse describes one of the most important Christian doctrines, and we call it the incarnation. We're going to be using that word a lot in this message. It's such an important word. The incarnation, literally that God incarnated flesh. It's really staggering when you think about it, right? God became a person. God became a person. God became one of us so that God could reach us. That's the incarnation. To be incarnational is to go the extra mile to meet someone where they're at. To be incarnational is to speak someone's language. To be incarnational is to be indigenous. Now, every time I do chapel with the preschool, which I do once a week, I try to be incarnational. What does that mean? It means I use words that 2 to 5-year-olds understand. And I choose songs with motions that they can do. And I reference shows or songs that they know. I talk about Paw Patrol. And I use props that connect with them, Birdie and Crocky. In all those ways, I am being incarnational. Now, it takes time, energy, effort, even money to be incarnational. Why would we do that? Why did God do that? Because love goes the extra mile. Today, as we continue our series on transformation, we are looking at transforming churches, or transforming vital congregations, as Bishop Hagia puts it on his diagram. And there are 2 key components to this priority of transforming churches: church revitalization and new faith communities. Those are 2 priorities for our CalPAC conference. Church revitalization and new faith communities. Revitalizing existing churches and starting new ones. And I believe that both existing churches and new churches are called to do the same thing. We are called to be incarnational. Why? Because the church exists to continue the ministry Jesus began. The church is called the body of Christ, which means his work is now ours. So if he was incarnational, we are called to be incarnational. Vital churches are incarnational. Paul certainly understood this. In today's scripture from 1 Corinthians 9, Paul describes his approach to ministry this way. We're not going to read it in full, but he says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law in order to reach them. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law in order to reach them. To the weak, I became weak so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that I might by all means save some." He's describing incarnational ministry, right? If I can paraphrase, in our context, he's saying, to the locals, I became as a local in order to win locals. To the Kalaheo students, I became as a Kalaheo student in order to draw them to Christ. To the retired senior adults, I became as a retired senior adult. To those in the military, I became as one in the military. To the millennials who've never been to church, I became as a millennial. In essence, Paul is saying, I met people where they were at. I moved into their neighborhood. I learned their language. I didn't force them to come into my world. I went into their world with the gospel. Why? Love. Love goes the extra mile. Vital churches are incarnational. And that is particularly key for us to understand in today's world because we live in a culture that is rapidly changing. And if the culture is changing, then the church must change as well in order to remain incarnational. I'll give you a really simple example, the Yellow Pages. 30 years ago, if a church said, we are going to be incarnational, we want to connect with our society, we want everyone we know to know that we are here, we're going to put a huge ad in the Yellow Pages. And when that lands in their driveway, they're going to go whenever they're trying to find a church and look in the Yellow Pages. What if a church was still doing that 30 years later? They would not be incarnational. because no one goes to the yellow pages to see what churches are in the area now. In a rapidly changing culture, incarnational churches are adaptive and innovative. So this is the kind of the, once again, high-tech picture. This is the world we find ourselves in. We live in a world where increasingly so, there is a wall between the church and the society. We live in a post-Christian world. We live in an increasingly secular world. That's the reality we find ourselves in. Now, in this reality, churches have a couple of choices. A church could say, we're going to stay the same, and, we'd love to have you climb over the wall and join us, right? You're invited to climb over the wall and join us. Or a church can say, we're going to be adaptive and innovative, and we're going to go the extra mile to build a bridge over this wall and meet you where you are. That's incarnational ministry. And the great thing about our church is we have such a rich history of incarnational ministry. We have a great example of incarnational ministry in how our church started. Kailua UMC was founded in 1927 by Chinpei Peter Goto. He was born in Japan. He immigrated here when he was 11 years old. He started our church. He started Parker UMC in Kaneohe, and he started Kahalu United Methodist Church. Now, Reverend Goto is known as the man of 3 B's. What are those 3 B's? Nice. Baseball, bicycle, and Bible. See, at the time, this era consisted primarily of Japanese immigrants. And Reverend Goto asked, how can I connect with these folks? How can I bring the gospel to them? Realize there's a lot of families here with kids, and they love to play baseball. So I'm going to hop on my bike. I'm going to ride around this area, and I'm going to start up baseball games and teams. Now, did Reverend Goto have a class in his theological training on bikes and baseball? Probably not. But he realized this is my best way to build a bridge to this culture. This is my best way of being innovative and adaptive in order to share God's love. Incarnational ministry. We also have a great example of incarnational ministry in how the Methodist Church was started. As Pastor Roger Ross explains it, John Wesley knew that something had to change. He realized that the Church of England of his day wasn't reaching the vast majority of British people. So God led him to abandon some of the conventional modes of ministry and to try some innovative approaches that led him to be more incarnational. Now, I want to mention 3 of these approaches as they're described by Pastor Roger Ross. Here's the first one. Go where the people are. See, Wesley was trained to understand, to believe that the gospel should only be preached inside a church building, should only be preached inside a sanctuary. But he recognized that a vast number of folks would never step foot in a church. So after a lot of prodding by the Spirit, Wesley began preaching in the open air. He started what is called field preaching, and it revolutionized the church in his day. Now, this was a huge risk for Wesley. This was not something he was comfortable doing. This was stepping outside of his comfort zone big time. Here's what he wrote in his journal. On the day, the very first time he tried field preaching, he wrote, at 4 in the afternoon, I submitted to be more vile, and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in a ground adjoining to the city, to about 3,000 people. For Wesley, the decision to go where the people are, the decision to be incarnational in that way, was for him a decision to be more vile. It was costly to him. He had to give up what he was used to, but he did so because love goes the extra mile. A second incarnational, innovative approach of the early Methodists used the music of the culture. Church hymns or songs in Wesley's day consisted primarily of Gregorian chants in Latin and heavy German music. The words were meaningful, but the music didn't connect with the people around him. It didn't speak their heart language. Wesley realized that non-Christians connected most easily to the gospel when it came through their native culture. So he encouraged his brother Charles to put gospel words to the popular tunes of the day. That's what Methodist hymns are. And it caught people's hearts. Music of the culture was one of the key ways that early Methodists were incarnational. Let me mention one other way. Use mass communication to get the word out. In Wesley's day, the means of mass communication was the printing press. And Wesley was innovative in his use of it, in how he wrote numerous sermons and tracts and books and published them far and wide. Thousands of people who never heard Wesley preach became Christians and grew in their faith through his writing, through the media of his day. Now, of course, we now live in a world of social media where we have unimaginable access to millions through the internet. Am I a big fan of social media? No, I'm not. I don't get it. But my 13-year-old son connects with the world through his cell phone. So if we're going to be incarnational, we best follow Wesley's example and use the technology around us to get the word out. Early Methodists, great example of ways that they were incarnational. We also have great examples of incarnational ministry in the Methodist churches around us. So many today. Within this church, churches in our conference. And I just want to offer one example. And I want to offer this because I was just in LA for 3 days of training this last week. The Methodist Church has pastors go for training in August in Indian Wells, which is next to Palm Springs. It was 115. So we were there for this training, but I was with one of my friends, Chris Spearman, who's a pastor. We served together at a church in LA. But years ago, Chris was assigned as an associate pastor to a church in Westwood, which is West LA, right near UCLA. This is a church that has a beautiful sanctuary, an amazing organ, gorgeous stained glass. It's the kind of church that people flock to for Christmas Eve services. Also a church that had been in decline for 25 years. So Chris came just asking questions, learning, listening. He decided to do a survey, to survey folks who were new to the church, people who joined the church in the last 5 years or so, and just asking them, how did you come to our church? And then he compiled the summary of his findings and presented them to the church council. He said, this is our current strategy. First, there has to be a healthy United Methodist Church somewhere else that develops disciples who are committed to being Methodist as adults. Second, these people end up moving to LA for school or for work or for other opportunities. Third, somehow they find our church, mainly by driving by, because the church is on a really busy street in West LA. Fourth, they're greeted by the two women in our church who make up our hospitality team. That's our strategy. How well is it working? And then Chris asked, can we try some new ways of being innovative? And he said, if we're going to do that, the most important step is to understand our culture, is to understand our context. That's the key to being incarnational, right? So they spent time just learning and reflecting on the culture. At the time, there was a movie that came out called Crash. You guys remember Crash? Crash is about LA. The premise of Crash is that people are so divided, so disconnected in LA that they will crash into each other in order to connect. And they realize most of the people around us are from somewhere else. So they don't have holiday traditions. They don't have family to lean on. And they are looking for, they're craving real life connection. So they started a small group in Chris's house. They also said, okay, we are in a highly educated community right near UCLA. These are folks who want to be challenged intellectually. These are folks who do not want to check their brain at the door of the church. They want to be engaged intellectually. And they took another step to kind of study their culture. One Sunday morning, during worship, right? So the time that church is meeting, right now for us, they sent 12 people out in teams of 2, and they said, take a camera and take a picture of where people are hanging out in our community right now. Just see where the folks are. What are they doing? So these 6 teams came back, and they showed all their pictures, and they saw 2 things in every picture. Well, almost every picture. Coffee and cell phones. All right, that's what showed up in the pictures. Coffee and cell phones. And they said, okay, that cup of coffee, that is the way people connect. So we want them to connect with a cup of coffee. And the cell phone is how people organize their lives. So if we want to be involved in their life, we need to be somehow connected in or through their cell phone. They ended up starting a ministry that's called The Loft. And I think we have just kind of their homepage. But they call it The Loft because they meet in the actual loft of the original sanctuary. And they meet in the round. There's no stage. There's no elevated space. The message is conversational. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of interaction. They have musicians in different parts of the room. They have a high presence in social media, and they started a number of small groups. So now they have 9 different small groups that meet. They started with 12 people. They now have about 200 on the rolls. They average about 115 in worship, and they're actually building new space. They're renovating their space because they've outgrown where they were meeting. Now, I think the real fruit of the Loft, and this is just one example, but the real fruit is the relationships. The real fruit is how that community has been a channel in which God has influenced people's lives. People who previously had no connection to the church or to God have come to have that. The real fruit is in the ways that they have seen life transformation. Now, I share this example not because I want us to look like the Loft. The Loft works in West LA. We're not in West LA. We're in Kailua. Incarnational ministry looks different here than there, right? I share this example to spark our imagination, to encourage us to continue to ask, how can we be adaptive and innovative? How can we build a bridge to the people around us? How can we be incarnational like Jesus? God didn't wait for us to come to Him. God sent His Son to us. God did whatever it took to meet us where we were at. Why? Because that's what love does. Love goes the extra mile.